All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Seth Foreman, CEO at Socialsuite, and I'll be your host. So the new B Corp 2025 standards are here, and they bring a game-changing twist, a formal materiality assessment. These changes have resulted in many questions in the world of B Corp, from what's changed, how does this overlap with other standards, and most importantly, how to do this right. So Socialsuite's very own Dr. Tim is here to break this down and more today. I do want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webinar content is going to last about 20 minutes, and then we'll run a Q&A session. If you have any questions, feel free to write your questions on the right-hand side in the chat area. Tim will either get to it right on the spot, or we'll make sure we answer those questions during the Q&A. We're also going to be recording today's webinar, and we will be distributing it to all attendees after the fact. The actual deck itself will be available on our website as well to download. Now, for those unfamiliar with Socialsuite, we're an AI-driven sustainability impact and risk management platform. We help companies to identify, manage, and monitor all their different ESG risks and impacts through technology. Our core products range from financial materiality assessments, impact materiality assessments, double materiality assessments, helping both corporates and consultants streamline that entire effort. We're backed by VCs from Salesforce Ventures, Tidal Ventures, and we've worked with hundreds of companies all over the world, from Europe to North America, all across Asia Pacific, and across many different industries and sectors. Now, as a reminder, on our website, we do have loads of different content, from blog articles and also webinars. If you go into our website, go to the webinar section, we've done sessions related to, of course, materiality assessments. We've done CSRD materiality assessments, risk management webinars, and many, many other topics. So feel free to go into that part of our website and take a browse and check out some of the other content that we also offer. All right, so with that all being said, we're gonna jump in now, and I'll be handing over the baton to our very own Dr. Tim Siegbeke van Hukelam, our Chief Impact Officer, to take it away and hear all about all the updates about B Corp. Tim, over to you.
Excellent, thanks Seth for that introduction. And indeed, today we are going to focus on what is in those new B Corp standards, but really kind of drilling into one key thing, that is the materiality assessment. What are the requirements? But first of all, we're going to look briefly at the evolution. So why did B Corp shift to more of that standardized materiality that we find already almost as best practice around the world? Then we'll really get to that point where we're going to break down the B Corp materiality requirements in detail, really looking at the key topic standard in which that is really outlined. What do you need to do? And then how do you get started? We'll show you how to make your materiality assessment B Corp compliant. So those are the three key areas today that we'll run through in the next 20 or so minutes. So first of all, why did B Corp shift to that standardized materiality? Now, what do I mean with standardized materiality? Maybe a quick primer is in place. I'm not going to spend too much time on here because you might already know materiality, but really quickly, if you look at the top right there, impact materiality, what we do in that case with the materiality assessment is we look at the positive and negative impacts that a company has on the outside world, on society and the environment. So that's impact materiality. We also have at the bottom right financial materiality, which is looking at the risks and opportunities that your company is facing. So what are the society and environment's impacts on you and on your company's financial performance? So what we do see is that for financial materiality, it is often linked to the ISSB, IFRS, and the SASB standards. They're really used for materiality assessment around financial materiality, risks and opportunities. If we look at impact materiality, we often think about the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, that helps you really do a materiality assessment on impacts. We take those two lenses And we do that at the same time. We call that double materiality. And that is when we look at the left side there, and we see that the European Union, through their CSRD, with the ISRS standards, requires you to do both impact and financial materiality. So working out what the impacts, risks, and opportunities are for your business. Now, where does B Corp fit in then? B Corp is really focused again on impact materiality, on your company's impacts on society and the environment. So what it means is it aligns really well if we think about standardized materiality with GRI, impact materiality, but likewise also with double materiality, because there's a strong impact component in there. So from a B Corp perspective, if you're doing an impact or a double materiality assessment, you're ticking the box. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail later. This is just to paint a picture. But how did they get there? If you're already certified with B Corp previously, you're familiar with the B Impact Assessment. If you're new to B Corp, you might wonder what that is. It is, I would call it now, a legacy tool or impact assessment, the BIA. And some people would refer to that sometimes as a materiality assessment, but it really wasn't. Not in the sense that GRI, CSRD, and ISRS define a materiality assessment. It was more a performance measurement tool. How well are you performing in terms of B Lab's view of what a business should do to be responsible and sustainable? So it was really designed to evaluate, score, and benchmark companies for B Corp certification. And it was very static in that scope. Same set of core topics. They didn't really look at your industry, value chain, actual material impacts. So if we compare that then in the table on the right-hand side, we see on the left there the legacy B Impact Assessment and how that addressed some of those components. And on the right-hand side, more of a generic view of a, let's call, standardized materiality assessment. So in terms of purpose, like I said, the legacy BIA was really about scoring and benchmarking companies. You probably remember what B Corp was really known for is the score. What is your B Corp score? Now, that is now something we're not going to have moving forward. In a materiality assessment, really the purpose is to identify and prioritize sustainability topics based on the significance to stakeholders and your company's actual material impacts, or if you do a double materiality assessment, risks and opportunities. So in terms of the scope then, the BIA was really preset, fixed questions on 5 impact areas, but the materiality assessment is tailored to the organization's activities, the value chain, the stakeholders, the topics that matter to your organization. So it's much more tailored. In terms of topics then, we see that the BIA was really looking at the same high-level impact areas and subtopics, and it applied to everyone. But again, in a materiality assessment, we're really drilling into what is specific to this company. Take a topic, animal welfare. Is that relevant to your company? If it's definitely not relevant, then why would you do a lot of stakeholder engagement around that? It's really about determining what is important by screening topics, value chain, and activities. The outcome of the two things are different as well. Where with the legacy BIA, it was that numeric score towards certification, and the materiality assessment is about getting that prioritized material list of topics that are based on clearly defined material impacts. So there's a real connect between your material impacts and your material topics. And in terms of alignment, there was no alignment. The BIA was really a proprietary B Lab framework tool, but now moving forward, what B Corp's doing in their new standard is saying the materiality requirement is really aligned with GRI and ISRS in that sense, in terms of the approach they take. And finally, then on stakeholder engagement, initially in the legacy BIA, it was optional and implicit. It was more about considerations around stakeholders, but now there is a real core requirement. And you could even see that when we get there in a couple of minutes, that there's a very specific stakeholder engagement requirement, even going further than GRI and ISRS. B Corp is now really giving you specific groups that you need to engage as a minimum. So it's really important to keep that in mind. So there's some real changes here. Now, that shift to standardized materiality, the question maybe still was, why do we do that? Now, what we see is that it really helps you to identify topics that you impact. So it's really about your company, your value chain, and the impacts you're having, rather than a more kind of fixed set of topics and getting some scores out there. It helps you to really document and profile what your impacts are. And if you do that double materiality, then also risks and opportunities. And in doing so, you're aligning with a process that is already credible in terms of ongoing sustainability reporting. So think about the GRI process or the ESRS process or a double materiality process. That's already out there. So we're responding to that global convergence where we really see that we want to make sure that we're all speaking the same language and that we can easily integrate B Corp into an existing ESG practice. We don't want to double up. We don't want proprietary frameworks and methodologies and approaches. We want to make sure that in the sustainability space at large, we all speak the same language, do the same thing, and that we together raise the bar around rigor. So no more flexibility and a lot of variations of what companies do. Some years ago, a materiality assessment could basically mean anything. It could be a captain's call where the CEO just picked a few topics all the way to a really good gold standard materiality assessment. We see there's more and more rigor getting into that process. And it's great to see B Corp getting at that same level now, saying we're all going to do the same thing here. And in doing so, it is not just a reporting or tick the box exercise. In the end, we're doing this materiality assessment to strengthen impact management. What we want to achieve is we want to understand material impacts that are really important that you're having on people, planet, and society, and making sure that we link that to your governance, your strategy, targets, and performance. So that's really important here. And that's why B Corp's moved to that existing best practice process around materiality. So let's then look at breaking down the B Corp materiality requirements. Now, the first step is maybe to look at those new standards. So we now have the 25 standards, or V7. So the latest version is the 7th version of the B Corp standards. I'm going to refer to them as the 2025 standards here. And we see they're made out of 3 foundational requirements, 1, 2, and 3. Everyone will need to do that, and everything in there is the same for everyone. But then we get to the second component, and that's what they call the performance requirements. They also call them impact topics, and we see there's 7 of them. And they've got some really nice kind of icons there to highlight them. And what B Corp has done here is that these are 7 impact topics that we deem highly material to any business aspiring to achieve high social and environmental performance, basically to be B Corp certified. So all of these topics apply to all of the companies that want B Corp certification. Now, that's really important to remember because we're going to look at that and drill into that a little bit later. And we're going to ask the question, how is these B Corp standards, how are they different from, for instance, the ESRS in Europe? And there is some differences in there. The main thing here, if we look at both of them, yes, the icons look somewhat different, but they're very similar at first glance. You don't see them displayed here, but both the ESRS or CSRD and B Corp have foundational requirements or requirements you need to do in any case. And then there are in the B Corp case, the impact topics, and on the ESRS, the topic standards. Now, what is the function then of the materiality assessment? Is it the same? What I'm going to do is now kind of show you how that slightly differs. And this is quite important. If we start with, on the left side, CSRD, what we're doing there is we have to do under ESRS 2 a double materiality assessment. And what we'll do in that double materiality assessment is identify our material impacts, but also risks and opportunities. So we're looking at both lenses. But we'll have those material impacts, risks and opportunities to help us then link that to topics and topic standards. So if we have material impacts, say under climate change, that means that ESRS E1 on the left there is material. That is what we need to look at for disclosure and to report on. So I've highlighted a few here. Let's assume that in green, through our materiality assessment, we've identified them, that we have impacts, risks, and opportunities. So we need to go into those particular standards and then link our impact, risks, and opportunities that are material to disclosure requirements and data points. And that will give us the actual disclosure requirements, the information we need to disclose under ESRS. Now, let's move to B Corp then. It works slightly different there. We see that actually in one of these standards here, and that is purpose, stakeholder, and governance. So that's the first one, PSG. in there is a requirement to do materiality assessment. So the materiality assessment does not sit in the foundational requirements, it sits in the purpose and stakeholder governance. And that means that, we'll look at that in a moment, that some companies will have to do a materiality assessment, but not everyone. So the materiality assessment, again, on the B Corp is meant to help you identify your impacts that you're having in terms of social, mostly focused on human rights, but also environmental. So you really need to work out what are your material impacts on the world to be able to manage them. Now, there's also another reason, and that's quite different here. We're not actually looking at these impact topics here, these 7, and say which ones are relevant, are material, like we do with ESRS. Now, all of them are relevant. What B Lab has done is they've, in each of these 7 standards, they've already predetermined which disclosures you as a company need to report on. So that's quite different from the ESRS. All of these 7 standards are likely to apply at first instance. You need to go in there and you'll need to look at 3 factors: at your size of your company, the sector, and the industry. And that will tell you whether a particular disclosure is relevant to you. But the materiality assessment does something else. It wants you to assess these 7 impact topics at large, so see them as categories and work out on each one of them, am I having material impacts? But you also need to look outside of B Lab and identify non-B Lab entity-specific material topics. Now that's a lot, but what could that mean? It could mean that you've worked out you're having impacts around data privacy or cybersecurity. Now, if you work that out, that means you'll also have to report that under B Lab. And we'll look at that in a moment, what that looks like. So what B Lab does, it gives you the minimum requirements to be certified through their foundation and performance requirements. And like I said, the specific requirements you need to report on are not coming out of the materiality assessment. That is already determined by B Lab. And that can range from 20 to 124 requirements. And if you look at the top right here on the PSD 1.1, the company establishes a public purpose to make a meaningful positive impact. We see then there's a little table included there with size, sector, and industry. And what we see here is that everyone needs to do PSD 1.1. But let's look at PSD 2.3. The company conducts regular materiality assessments to identify material topics. We do see there that the first 3 there in terms of size, extra, extra large, and large, every sector and industry needs to do that materiality assessment to identify their material topics. So that's really important. Now, you do see that I've highlighted medium there as well. It says none and none. But we'll look at a moment as well. There are some reasons why medium-sized companies will have to consider doing a materiality assessment. And why is that? Let's look at one here from the human rights standard. And what we need to do is we need in this human rights standard identify salient human rights issues. And salient is pretty much the same as material. It's important, relevant to the company. And what we see is that historically material was more linked to financial materiality, and in the kind of human rights or social space, we see that saliency is often used. But what it really means is what are material human rights issues for your business? Now, let's look at that table again. And what we see here is that, yes, extra large, extra large, and large companies in different sectors, but all industries, will need to do this exercise. But we also see that a number of medium companies in specific sectors will need to do this. Now, what you might want to do is a specific human rights assessment to work this out. But if you also look at the other standards, you'll find there's more requirements. Under ESC 1, you're going to look at if the company knows its actual and potential impacts on the environment, and a lot of subtopics there. So you'll also then have to do an environmental impact assessment, or if you do a good double materiality assessment, what you'll do in that case is you'll identify all of these impacts all at once. So as a medium company, then you either might want to do a separate specific exercise or do a good materiality assessment, and you'll tick all the boxes. So again, it's really important as a company to go through these tables and work out what are the actual requirements that B Lab has already set for my company, and then how am I going to approach that? For a lot of companies, large, extra large, and extra large, you have to do that materiality assessment in any case. For medium companies, it could be a good reason to also do a materiality assessment. Next, let's unpack then what the actual requirements are. And again, like I said, it is in purpose, stakeholder, and governance. And if we go to 2.3 there, we see that the company needs to conduct regular materiality assessment to assess and identify material topics. Like I said, larger companies need to do it. Medium companies are put on notice here. Have a really good look at if it makes sense to do that as well. It needs to be regular, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. You need to engage with stakeholders. We'll unpack that too. And the reason, again, to do this is that you need to identify the most significant or material social environmental impacts your business is having or your organization is having. Then under 2.4, that is post-materiality assessment, once you've identified your material topics, you also might have identified topics that are not addressed in the B Lab standard, like cybersecurity. In that case, you'll need to set targets and report progress annually on those specific topics and impacts you're having. So if we drill down then on 2.3, which is about that materiality assessment, we'll see there are a number of criteria. And these are the things you'll have to make sure that you're doing your materiality assessment to make sure it is compliant with this process that B Lab outlines here for you. The first one is stakeholder engagement. You need to run a stakeholder engagement process to inform the assessment. And they're very specific about who you need to engage. And this is, like I said, goes a little bit above and beyond GRI and ESRS. They also flag you need to engage with stakeholders. GRI is, I think, the most flexible. Under ESRS, they say you need to engage with affected stakeholders. And B Corp says, well, you need to go out, A to F, workers, suppliers, customers, investors, where offices are located, subsidiaries, and the local or global environment. So they really are very specific. And that's at a minimum. There might be more stakeholders that you do want to engage with. The next requirement is looking at salient or material human rights and environmental issues. We already looked at that briefly. So you really need to make sure that in your materiality assessment, you're assessing that. So again, a good case to do all that together in a materiality assessment rather than running separate environmental impact assessment or human rights assessment. You can do that all at once if you run a really solid materiality assessment. You need to, in that materiality assessment, evaluate the B Lab topics. So we've seen those 7 topics. Those 7 impact topics have subtopics as well. The entity-specific topics that are relevant to your company. You need to also either run an impact materiality or double materiality approach. That's really important. And you need to assess the significance of the topics and impacts and determine where you set the thresholds for materiality. So at some point in this process, for impacts, you're going to score them. What is the scale, the scope, the irremediability for negative impacts? So it's really important to do that. And ESRS has laid out a really solid process that most companies follow. So you can just follow that. But at some point, you need to determine when does something actually score high enough to become material to my company. Then you need to provide oversight of the materiality process by the highest governance body. So making sure that might be your board that are actually part of this process and that they provide oversight, that they understand what you're doing, and that they ultimately validate and endorse this process and the outcomes. And then making the materiality methodology and results available. And this is important that it's not just here are my 5 or dozen material topics. It is really about the methodology as well. How have you gone about this process? I've taken a double materiality approach. I've used these topic standards. I've identified my value chain. How have you done that? What are the impacts I've identified? Which ones are material? How have I scored things, etc. So the methodology is 50% at a minimum of that public disclosure. And then, of course, the results. What in the end was material and why? Now, what I've done then, which might be useful, I'm not going to unpack this in detail today, but this will be in a deck if you want to take a further look. I've tried to link the requirements that we just looked at from B Corp PSD 2.3 to GRI and to ESRS, or CSRD for that matter, but it's from the ESRS standards, to show you how does that link and what is different there. There are not massive differences, but we've seen in the previous slide, there are definitely a few things to really closely pay attention to that you're incorporating that in your materiality assessment. So the next step then is, how do you make your materiality assessment B Corp compliant? Now, there are a few things and ways to think about, and already flagged, a materiality assessment is quite a process. There are quite a few steps to take. But what I want to do is particular about those impact topics and subtopics show you how you can integrate that in a materiality assessment. And I've tried to create a flowchart here to show you, this is definitely not exhaustive. Like I said, there are a lot more steps in a good materiality process. But what I try to do is to show you how do you take those B Corp topics and subtopics and integrate them into a materiality assessment that ticks the boxes in terms of what's required. Let's start on the left-hand side here with the assumption that your organization wants to do a materiality assessment. And it could be various reasons why you want to do that, and it could be various approaches. Now let's look at the approaches you could be taking. The first one is just, I want B Corp certification, so I need to do a materiality assessment. That's number one. The second one is, I'm already planning to do a double materiality assessment, thinking of using GRI for impact and CSRD, ISSB for our financial materiality, risk and opportunities. And I want to add that B Corp component to it to make sure that it ticks all the boxes. The third one is I'm doing a double materiality assessment under the CSRD, and I want to make sure it's B Corp compliant. The fourth one is I'm doing a single materiality assessment but focused on impacts using GRI, and I want to make that B Corp compliant. But the last one then, I'm doing a single materiality assessment that's about financial materiality, so risks and opportunities only, using, for instance, CSRD or ISSB. Now, that is not sufficient. B Corp is very clear about it. You need to include that lens on impacts. So for the first four, we're going to look at how that looks like. The fifth one, you'll have to add in that impact perspective. So that brings you back then to either number 2 or number 3. Now let's look at 1 to 4. We want to make sure that in those materiality assessments, we incorporate B Corp. So we start with the 7 impact topics. And for each one of them, those performance requirements, we're going to go into the topic standards and look at what is relevant to my organization. And look at for each of the things that we have been flagged as relevant for my organization, they are related to particular subtopics. So we're going to take them, note them down. As a next step then, we're going to look at all those topics and subtopics from B Corp and see if we can map that best we can to what we're using. And that could be GRI, ESRS, CSRD. And in particular, we're going to have that impact focus, so mostly on GRI and ESRS. How can we link that and map that? And I've already put a little example there at the bottom. So from B Corp, we might see under ESC 1.6 that animal welfare. That is relevant to our organization. We find that in GRI 13, which is on agriculture, that might be relevant to our business as well. Under 11, animal health and welfare practices. We might say, hey, that links up really nicely. So kind of create that link. Now, it might not link up really nicely. It might be for various reasons. So in that case, you're going to keep both. And then later, we're going to look at the topic list. What we want to do now is, now that we've kind of tried to match where we can, we're also going to look at what are GRI, ESRS, and CSRD topics that are relevant to my business. And we're going to add that to the B Corp specific subtopics that we've identified. So we're building this topic universe, but we're going to make it really specific to our organization. Now, once we have that topic list and we've mapped it best we can, what we want to do then is engage our stakeholders on our topic list. And how we do that is we'll go out with the GRI, ESRS, and CSRD topics and any B Corp only specific topics that we could not map. We're then going to determine significance and materiality based on that whole stakeholder engagement and scoring process. Now, here there's a lot more that plays into the materiality assessment. There's also things like value chain and IRO mapping, and that engagement and interviews and workshops and surveys potentially. I've really simplified it here. The blue boxes are generally things you'll do anyways. The yellow boxes are more that adding that B Corp flavor. And once we've determined that what is material to our business, topics and impacts, we're then going to do a B Corp compliance check. Because what could happen is that you've identified something that a topic might be not material from a, say, GRI perspective, but you have identified that you do need to report on that on the B Corp's performance requirements. So that's really important. Going back to the start of the webinar, B Corp is already worked out for you what you need to report on. The materiality assessment is for you to identify your material impacts on human rights, on people, on the environment. And for each of those impacts you're having, you should come up with a management plan. You need to manage them. Now, you might also find out of the materiality assessment that are B Corp, non-B Corp material topics. So like again, cybersecurity, data privacy, they might not really come out of the B Corp standards, but you find them elsewhere and you say, hey, these things are material to us as a business. So in that case, you'll have to still report on them on the B Corp on the PSG 2.4. And you have to set your own targets and report them based on those targets, your performance and progress. So with that, a really quick overview. Now, there's, like I said, a lot more to this, and it does become very company specific in terms of relevant subtopics, which topics you select from GRI, ISRS, CSRD, how do you do that mapping? That's really something that's very important to do well. But if you do that well and you check those B Corp compliance at the end, you have a really good materiality assessment. So this is something that I think a lot of people will have to work through and do that mapping and work out. But I think that this is a really good process to make sure that you maximize the value by doing one materiality assessment, and you can tick a lot of boxes at the same time. So you're not redoing materiality for various reasons. You're doing it all at once. So in summary, if we think about doing that, kind of looking at that B Corp materiality requirement, it's not replacing anything. It's not replacing the existing DMA, whether that be ISRS or GRI and CSRD. What it's doing, it's really providing an extra overlay to ensure that your topic universe and disclosures meet B Corp's performance requirements. So it's a third lens in a way to your DMA. So the first one is you do that impact materiality. That's required. B Corp's very clear on that. Optional is adding that double materiality, financial materiality perspective in it. You don't have to do that, but it is best practice. And then the third lens is making sure that B Corp's impact priorities and topics and subtopics are included in their mandatory requirements. So things like stakeholder engagement, making sure you engage with the relevant groups. So it's really about adding that lens throughout your materiality assessment. So with that in mind, we're coming to the point where I'm going to invite Seth back onto the stage here and tell you a little bit about how we at Socialsuite can help you with this process.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, this is a fantastic presentation. So for everybody in the audience at Socialsuite, we do have a number of different solutions to help companies and consultants run materiality assessments. We have a set of solutions for corporates. So if you work at a company, we have our software that is available for purchase that can be fully configured for B Corp. And to run a B Corp materiality assessment, this includes and has add-ons for different supporting layers, from a do-it-yourself academy to also having additional advisory help. We also separately, we love consultants and advisors. We have very deep partnerships all over the world with different advisors. And we have a full licensing program if you're an advisor and you're looking to leverage software and technology to work with your own customers. We have those options available as well, along with other different types of training programs. I'm going to put in the chat here, we do have a link that if you do have any questions or if you want to reach out to us about learning more about our different software options, please feel free to click on our book a demo link. All right, so let's move into Q&A. Tim, do you want to, I know that we have a couple questions right in the chat, so do you want to take Yoshi's questions about other types of visualizations around the materiality, other types of materiality visualizations? Do you want to start there?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is really something that has happened coming out of the double materiality process that has kind of been mandated in Europe. What is happening is that we're, to a degree, still talking about sustainability topics, but the material topics that we talk about are related, actually, if you drill down into them, to your material impacts, risks, and opportunities. And that is what's really important. We want to understand not just that water usage is important, but why is that material to you? So what are the actual impacts you're having around water usage? That's what's important. So in terms of the visualizations, yes, we can still do a nice matrix with impact and financial materiality and plot water usage on there and say it is financially or impact material or doubly material. We do still see those matrices out there, and they're quite nice actually, because it does give you a quick overview of where the topics sit. But at the same time, a lot of people actually want to understand that list of material impacts, risks, and opportunities. And we've seen various ways companies are playing with that in terms of visualizations, simple tables with columns, but there's very creative ways of doing that. At the same time, sometimes it's overcomplicated and you can't really actually read it. I would say the majority of companies are still going with a basic double materiality matrix, but then really making sure to disclose their table with impact, risks, and opportunities. That's a really good practice approach.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. All right, we got another question from Uganish. I think this is a great question. So if companies are reporting using financial materiality, he's saying they basically need to do extra work by doing double materiality. So maybe if you could talk about, and there was another direct question to me as well. Essentially, if you have a financial materiality assessment, how can you use it to comply with B Corp, both from an impact and double materiality perspective?
Now, great question. B Corp is very clear on that. B Corp is about impacts you're having on the world. So financial materiality is about how's the world impacting your business bottom line. So you need to do the work. You have to look at impacts that you're having on the world. So that means you do need to look at impact materiality. If you are planning to do a financial materiality assessment, yes, you'll need to add that impact lens to it. So you'll have to do a double materiality assessment if you really kind of want to do it according to what B Corp requires. If you're considering what to do right now, you're looking at B Corp certification, you don't have any other requirements, then the minimum required from a B Corp perspective is doing an impact materiality assessment. But you can add that financial materiality perspective to it. So if it's just B Corp you're going for, you don't have any other reasons, you could just go with impact materiality in and of itself. Again, best practice would be double materiality. But in any case, for B Corp, you have to do impact materiality.
All right, we got another question that came directly to me. And so reading it here, it says, how much stakeholder engagement do I need to do to comply with B Corp's materiality assessment?
That's an excellent one. And I think what B Corp is now trying to make you do is actually engage with specific stakeholder groups. Because what we see is that both GRI and ESRS have tried to mandate and stimulate and encourage companies to go out and talk to people to understand, I guess, the lived experience about particular impacts on them and on the environment and how they experience that. But it's not been clear enough. And we still see that companies, even in a very comprehensive process, say, oh, we've done stakeholder engagement and they spoke to a few people internally. And that's why B Corp is now very clear. They got 7 categories that you need to go out to, and quite a few of them are external. So you need to go out to those people. It doesn't prescribe for each group how many people you need to speak with and how you do that in terms of the process itself. It doesn't tell you whether it's a face-to-face interview, a virtual interview, a workshop, a focus group, a survey, but you do need to engage them in one form or another to get their views on impacts that affect them. So there's no particular number in terms of the individual stakeholders, but the groups are very clear. A to F, number of groups, and they would, I think common sense prevails here that it's not one person per group. There would be more individuals in each group.
All right, and last question I have is, what's your recommendation on how companies can get started on their B Corp materiality assessment?
That's excellent. I think what I find is that a lot of companies are exploring this now in terms of, hey, the new B Corp standards, do we need to do materiality or not? Now, if you're large and hire a larger company than that, you'll have to do it. So they're trying to work out what does that look like. If you're a medium-sized company, I would highly recommend you also look into that. So how you do that is definitely reading the B Corp standards and working out through that flow chart what I've just shown, what you need to do. But I do find that a lot of both companies and practitioners do get stuck with doing a good materiality assessment. So B Corp tells you what needs to be in a materiality assessment, but lot of people just don't know how to run a really good materiality process that is compliant with, say, GRI, ESRS, for that matter, and then integrating B Corp into that. So I think talk to someone who knows how this works and get on that journey of exploring what the steps are. And ask yourself, why are we doing this? In that flowchart, is it just for B Corp? Are there additional benefits in doing a good materiality assessment so I can tick the box for a lot of other things? And that might be for those particular standards. It might be for strategy setting. It might be for operational improvement. It might be that you need to do more stakeholder engagement. There are often a lot of boxes you can tick by doing one good double materiality assessment.
Perfect. I think that wraps up Q&A, Tim. So wrapping up today, so on the left here, you have both my contact information along with Tim's. Feel free to reach out to either of us directly if you do have any questions. As mentioned, Socialsuite does have a fully configured B Corp materiality assessment software. So if you are about to go through this process and you're interested in learning more about our software solutions, along with other support solutions, please reach out to us. We're happy to take you through and provide a demo and explain more about how we can support your efforts to comply with B Corp. Other than that, again, we're going to be sending this webinar post-call, and we will have this deck available on the website for to be able to download as well. So thanks again for your time today. Great job, Tim, and look out for the next webinar from Socialsuite.